including young academies or cohort-based leadership programs that bring together earlier career scientists, and also other international programs, can be used to provide independent advice to the governments on issues related to climate. Our 6 panelists will introduce their institutions, and they will also provide examples from their own institution, including collaborations on how this has been done in the past or what is in the works. We have 6 panelists for this session. I will briefly introduce them, and they are sitting in the order they will be presenting. First of all, Jovana Milic. She's a member of the Global Young Academy, and she co-leads the Science Advice Working Group. She's also an executive board member of the Swiss Young Academy, leading the Swiss Young Network for Science, Policy and Diplomacy, as well as the Smart Energy Materials Research Group at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. She's invested in renewable energy technologies for sustainable development while connecting and supporting young scientists globally through international multidisciplinary collaboration and science outreach, policy and diplomacy. To her left, we have Hussam Hussein. He's the Executive Director of Partnerships for Development at the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan and a Research Associate in Water Diplomacy at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on the role of discourses in shaping water policies in the Middle East, on transboundary water governance and critical hydropolitics, and on issues related to the political economy of water. Next to him, and my hesitation is because we have 2 Hussams, so I was making sure I was reading the bios in order, Hussam Mahmoud. He's a George T. Abel Professor in Infrastructure at Colorado State University. His research is focused on sustainable and resilient infrastructure and communities. He is the current chair of the New Voices of the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Also from Colorado State University, Gillian Bowser. Her work focuses on ecological indicators of climate change, such as pollinator insects and linkages between changing ecological conditions, local community livelihoods, and climate. She places special emphasis on sustainability, citizen scientist engagement, and encouraging more students from underrepresented backgrounds to study science. And I had the pleasure of being in one of your sessions earlier today, so I can confirm all of the above. Sébastien Treyer is Executive Director of IDDRI. I realize that I skipped the order now. IDDRI, meaning the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. He's a graduate from École Polytechnique, Chief Engineer of the Corps of Water and Bridges, Water and Forests, and a PhD in Environmental Management. He was in charge of foresight studies at the French Ministry of the Environment and played an active role in leading the interface between science and policy and scientific programming at the European Commission, the French National Research Agency, and territorial actors. So before, we have Martin Piker. He is from the IEP, yes, I was missing an E, Institute for European Environmental Policy. He has been there since January 2023 as Head of Strategic Relations and Activities. Prior to IEEP, Martin spent several years in Asia and South America, spearheading partnerships and advocacy for research institutions based in the Global South, with a focus on sustainability, agriculture, and public health in the context of the SDGs. Prior to this, he worked in Brussels, focused on sustainable development policy. Thank you, everyone. And let's start with the program. And Jovana, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It is a real pleasure to be here and to also complement this discussion with the perspective from the Global Young Academy, which is an independent academy gathering 200 members who are early career scientists and who together with over 360 alumni represent more than 100 countries around the world. They're selected on the basis of their research excellence, as well as broader societal impact through their scientific leadership and broader contributions to their communities, with the vision to provide science for all and science for the future. Now, this becomes particularly relevant in the context of the ongoing climate emergency, as it requires a global action across borders, disciplines, and generations in order to enable a sustainable future. And with that in mind, the Global Young Academy has been committed to connecting, supporting, engaging, and empowering young scientists across various interdisciplinary projects and initiatives, international collaborations, as well as continuously supporting the national young academies, amplifying the voices of young scientists and enabling them to lead this international, interdisciplinary, and intergenerational dialogue at the interface of science and society, improving the research environment, enabling science education and outreach, as well as emphasizing their role in achieving some of the sustainable development goals, which is particularly reflected in a number of our working groups, one of which I represent being the Science Advice Working Group, but also a number of others, such as the Trust in Young Scientists, as well as the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group, who have not only been connecting the young scientists on this topic, but also building their capacities to address some of these global challenges. Now, this has also been complemented by a number of international collaborations with various international institutions, some of whom are highlighted here, including our parent Leopoldina Academy in Germany, all European academies, the InterAcademy Partnership, the World Academy of Sciences, International Science Council, INSA, UNESCO, the European Commission, World Science Forum, and many others, including the International Year of Basic Sciences for Sustainable Development initiative that we have also contributed to over the past year. Overall, through this now international and transdisciplinary collaborative effort, establishing connections with early career and mid-career researchers and scientists, we strengthen a global network that contributes to building capacity, but also trust that is necessary for addressing some of the most pressing global challenges, including the climate emergency, which I will be delighted to discuss in more detail throughout this panel, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I should have said that the model we will follow is that everybody will go through their brief introduction of themselves and the institution they represent today, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion and for Q&A. Next is Hussam Hussein from the Royal Scientific Society, Jordan.
Thank you very much for the very kind invitation and introduction. So it's a pleasure to introduce to you and to represent here the Royal Scientific Society, which is an example of a senior National Academy of Science, but it's quite unique because it's different than most of other Academy of Science because of its history. So it was established back in 1970, when in the region there were, like after the 1967 war, forced migrations to Jordan, therefore a growing population in Jordan, and they needed to support the government with sound and evidence and scientific sound evidence and research and knowledge on how to proceed towards the economic and social development of the country. In that spirit, there was a royal decree, and the late King of Jordan, King Hussein, decided to establish the Royal Scientific Society in order to produce that knowledge needed to support food security, water security, and so on and so forth in the country. And therefore, there was a need for research, a need for basic research, but also social sciences, research for the economic and social development of the country. So in that spirit, the Royal Scientific Society since 1970 produces advice and scientific advice and research to the government, but also testing, and provides with its labs standards on the different types of products that are imported and produced also in the country. So that's how the Royal Scientific Society was established. Today we have 600 employees, both technical experts but also academics that produce that kind of research and knowledge for the sustainable development of Jordan. And in particular, they focus, and we focus, on the key priority of the countries in line with the national strategies and the economic modernization vision of Jordan, and therefore the main challenges that we face. Obviously, refugees is a big challenge, but also water security, energy security, food security, and so on and so forth. So the Royal Scientific Society of Jordan is basically a big research center that has basically staff employed to conduct this testing research and also academic research. But also it's very, very important for us to ensure partnerships, local partnerships as well as global partnerships, under the leadership of our president of the RSS, which is Her Royal Highness Princess Sumaya, who has been very, very much involved through UNESCO and through the partnerships with IAP, ISC, and so on and so forth, in ensuring that we are not reinventing the wheel, but we are actually trying to identify synergies with global partners and also with the GYA. In fact, Her Royal Highness Princess Sumaya is on the advisory board of our GYA, and I'm also a member of the executive committee of GYA. So it's really trying to be out there and to work both for the sustainable development of Jordan, but also supporting our partners both ways in advancing science and trust in science. We have different research centers in line with our core challenges and interests, as mentioned, but also what we do are a series of reports on climate change through the Water, Environment and Climate Change Center that we have at the Royal Scientific Society, supporting, for instance, the Ministry of Environment and the government with the NDC report and other key reports for the climate change sector, but also both on mitigation and adaptation analysis in cooperation with the relevant ministries. We also host the National Energy Research Center, which is part of the RSS, and we work a lot on raising awareness in local communities and producing also through our policy think tank within RSS policy briefs, which have the goal to advise and direct towards sound scientific policy in the country. And finally, science diplomacy is something that we really are trying to put a lot of emphasis on. We collaborate a lot with the AAAS and with UNEP, and we're organizing currently a workshop that will take place in January on transboundary implications of adaptation to climate change. And there we will bring key experts from Jordan and from the region to really discuss how to best tackle adaptation to climate change. So that's how we basically operate in terms of climate advice. It's by producing knowledge and being involved in relevant committees together in collaboration with the relevant ministries, in particular for climate change with the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Water, Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Energy, to ensure that in the governmental committees we have representatives of the academic and scientific community, both from RSS but also from the broader academic community in Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you. Hussam, you're next to represent New Voices, Youth National Academies.
Opportunity. I would like to just quickly thank Colorado State again and the School of Global Environmental Sustainability for facilitating this and for this wonderful opportunity. So I'm here wearing the New Voices hat as opposed to Colorado State faculty hat, although I don't mind wearing both. But I'm going to sort of mention some of the stuff we've been doing within the New Voices, which is sort of a young version of the Senior Academy at NASM. Just to give you some examples on some of the activities, the first presentation did a really nice highlight of what are the typical things that young academies get involved with. So I want to show you what that means for New Voices. We have tons of activities going on. This is just meant to provide only an example of what we've been doing. I'm also the founder of the Climate Group, so it makes sense that I'm here also, not just in my capacity as the chair of the New Voices, but also the founder of the Climate Group with the New Voices. We have been looking at various things. One of the things we started with as a group to look at engineering education. What are the needs to change for the climate change era. So what kind of changes should we be looking for? Just to give you just a flavor of what we looked at, we put our heads together. Now the New Voices program, we are part of cohort 2, which has about 22 members coming from different backgrounds, engineering, social science, medical sciences, and many other different fields. So we put our heads together to discuss what would be required to have in future engineers to be able to address climate change. So one of the things we talked about is to understand how the climate and sustainability and resilience are all linked. If I speak from my background as a civil engineer, structural engineer by training, none of that is discussed within any of the classes or any of the curriculum that we teach at Colorado State or what I was taught when I was a student back at Minnesota, University of Minnesota. We also want to incorporate a wide range of disciplines into engineering solutions, and the emphasis on social science or socioeconomic consequences and how communities fabric, not just the physical infrastructure, but social and economic systems should be integrated with engineering models that allow you to develop solutions that are tailored to communities. The idea of one-size-fits-all solutions definitely doesn't work. Cultural norms becomes important, economic sort of prosperity becomes important, and many other things. We also want to understand the ethics and justice dimensions of engineering. Again, when I was an undergraduate student back at the University of Minnesota, we didn't have any classes on ethics. Now, it's a very important topic now that we understand that certain communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And as that continues to become a problem moving forward, which it will, we definitely have to now look beyond just an engineering solution and understand what would that mean in terms of the impact on marginalized communities. So ethics, and the idea of ethics here becomes actually something that is not just has to be tied to engineering. Engineers must understand that ethics might require extra spending, right? And they have to be okay with this. I want to share a quick example of that. We've been looking at some work that has to do with sea level rise and the impact of that on foundation of buildings. And we saw that this could cause tremendous deterioration to foundations. Now, this idea is not that difficult of someone to envision. If you're a civil engineer, that makes perfect sense. So how come nobody considers that in the design of the foundations? It's because they choose to ignore it. They design, or we design things, based on initial cost, not based on life cycle cost or what could happen in the future. That has to change because obviously it's not going to work anymore. And the other thing that we talked about in this particular paper that we worked on is we must listen and cooperate or collaborate with diverse communities, because when you develop a solution thinking that you know what the answer is without talking to the communities and without understanding what their needs are, these solutions typically don't work. So this was one example of one thing that we've been working on within the New Voices. This is actually the first thing we started as the climate group. We published sort of a position paper in the Journal of Engineering Education, and it's getting a lot of attention. We can see the citations rising pretty fast on that. The second example I would like to share is related to other stuff we're working on as part of the, again, the climate group. So we looked at extreme heats and how hospital capacity becomes very relevant indicator in addressing or understanding the vulnerability to extreme heat. If you look at current ways of understanding extreme heat, usually it's the temperature coupled with social parameters, but there is no incorporation of healthcare system availability or capacity in determining the potential for having a high vulnerability to extreme heat. So we developed a new indicator. We called it hospital capacity in extreme heat, and we aggregated and overlaid different indicators, including summertime extreme heat days, population over age of 65 as a rough proxy for increased vulnerability to heat illness, and also the number of hospital beds per capita in a county on top of it. And when you do this, and I'm just showing you a very short version of what we've done, but you can see the top picture and the bottom different stories in terms of what the vulnerability to extreme heat would look like. And we did this for the US, and you can see significant increase in vulnerability and geographic distribution across the US to extreme heat. Now, this example is meant to show you one of the technical stuff we were working on, and it was mentioned early that these young academies are meant to provide science advice. Now, within New Voices, we're very serious about this. We're not just there to go to Washington, D.C., although NESM has a beautiful building that I visited a few times, so I encourage you to go visit if you haven't been there. But we want to do much more than that. It's not just we're going there to have a meeting or talk to people. We want to actually do something that hasn't been thought about before, that might be beneficial. This might actually cause other things to develop within NESM. I will just, my final comment on this, we started, this was the second example we did, and off of this, we actually established a webinar series on One Health, related to healthcare system, related to other health issues, and all of that started to come following this work. So there's a lot more for us to do within the New Voices. This shows us 2 examples of things that we've done. We've done a lot more, and I'm happy to talk to you about it later after the session, give you more details. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gillian is next, also wearing a lot of hats, and the affiliation you will see there will be with the Youth Environmental Alliance in Higher Education Network. But today you will focus on your leadership role in IUBS, the International Union of Biological Sciences.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. You hear me okay? So I'm actually wearing several hats, like my colleague here from Colorado State University in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. And I study things mostly with 6 legs or more, so most of the insect world. And why that's important in this space is that we talk a lot about biodiversity loss and very little about how we actually measure that, or what aspect of biodiversity loss we're talking about. And the reason why I bring that up as a start is there are 2 pieces here. One is that biodiversity loss is very complex and very different from social society indicators or climate indicators, et cetera. And none of us have the capacity as a scientist to do all the above. So we need a partnership, and we need a union of different capacity or different types of influence or different types of disciplines to be able to answer a simple question like biodiversity loss. So I also represent the Youth Alliance in Higher Education, which is a group, a network of institutions. There are about 15 of us, and I see a couple of my colleagues are here. It's an idea of bringing a bunch of institutions together with different disciplinary skills so our students can be exposed to many different types of way of looking at science or looking at the same problem with a different lens. And more importantly, we bring in institutions from all over the world so that they can meet someone with a different cultural lens to the same science question. Because we bring our culture into how we ask a science question. It's important to separate that. But I want to highlight today this issue about becoming a union and thinking more about how we as the science observers, whether you are a practitioner of science or a participant of science, how are we working together? We assume our countries need to work together as negotiators based on hard science, but we actually haven't looked in this space, how do we work together? And how do we look at the benefits of having a union of biological societies? So I wear my other hat as an executive member of the steering committee for the International Union of Biological Sciences, which is actually a fairly old institution. It's over 103 years old. I want to highlight that it focuses on the natural sciences that address the structure, function, limits of the Earth herself, and also responds to the current challenges. And again, in this space, it's just important to think about that we focus on greenhouse gases, and we focus on the climate drivers and the climate pressures. But the response mechanisms are often an environmental response, whether it's extreme event, whether it's an invasive species, whether it's a disease event, et cetera. So all those are moving in the larger field of biological sciences. It's important to think about that. And the second is that well-being is tied very tightly to the condition of our planet and of our Mother Earth, and understanding how we as scientists bring that well-being, whether it's a health well-being or environmental well-being, together into our work, such that we can inform negotiators as to how they can better negotiate for the intersection of these things. So the International Union of Biological Sciences is sort of one way to think about how we can come together as scientists and ask more fundamental questions and think across it. So as I said, it's about 100 years old. It was established in 1919. There are 110 national, scientific, and institutional members. They have 3 different types of memberships. And why that's important is that it functions to bring scientists together across the biological sciences. It does meet once every other year, and it has an executive. And one of our goals is to look at how do we bring the sciences together for the health of the planet. So trying to bring it that way. How do the biological sciences help us answer some of these complex questions? So the specific objectives are to promote the study of biology, both basic, theoretical, and applied, to initiate and facilitate research, and that collaborative research that crosses international boundaries. And particularly one of our biases, or my biases, is education, making sure we're bringing our students with us and the next generation of negotiators comes forward. But more importantly, in this space, to think about the facilitating interdisciplinary and collaborative research. So I don't know if many of you were at there's a group of higher education institutions that are getting together at the COP each year to create networks of networks to how do we all come together to ask these questions and work together to share our science for the betterment of society. And this is an important place to do that, whether it's taxonomy about bugs that tie to insects that have health implications, that have other implications to human health and well-being, as well as our livelihoods and stock. So as I said, I serve on the executive committee. We just started, so the U.S. has been sort of in and out of our participation in the International Union, and we're coming back in. And part of why that's important is, on top of our letters and activities, we do fund conferences to ask overarching questions at the international nature, where the international professional societies come together and ask questions. And it's an important way to think about a funding opportunity. But, oops. Sorry about that. But more importantly, I think it's good to highlight that we are starting to think about how we bring together, it's particularly in the US, we bring together committees to look at how the biological sciences can better network to answer some of these global questions and global problems. And we're looking forward in the discussion today is just how can we do that on an international stage, and getting just suggestions and advice as we start to move forward with this process, which would include the national academies, various universities, as we come together to try and answer that question. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks so much, Gillian. And it's actually an honor to be part of this very, very esteemed panel. I have to say I might be a little bit the odd man out here. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a PhD. I'm not a practitioner of science, as you put it. I am a participant, but I'm more of a promoter of science. So really, I like to think that I play a not unimportant role, I think, in shaping that science to policy impact pathway through the work that I do at the Institute for European Environmental Policy. So a little bit about IEP. We're based in Brussels. We're a membership organization of 17 think tanks across Europe in 15 countries. We've been around for almost 50 years, so not 100, but yeah, still quite a long time. Basically what we do is we advance sustainability policies in Europe. And since 2020, with the adoption of the European Green Deal, that policy package has really been the backbone of our policy analyses that we develop. How do we do this? We work with a wide variety of stakeholders, from the grass tops to the grassroots, to produce these evidence-based research and policy insights, or like I like to call them, the knowledge products. And basically, we work with European institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, international bodies such as UNEP, academia through our think tank networks and partnerships with universities, but also with civil society and private sector partners. We focus on all the areas of the Green Deal, as well as global challenges and the SDGs. I think that's not important. I think the European Union does not operate in a silo, and nor do European policies stop at the borders. And we actually do that around 5 policy programs, and which are climate and circular economy, land use and climate, biodiversity, ecosystem services, land use and climate, biodiversity and ecosystem services, global challenges and the SDGs, the Common Agricultural Policy and Food. And then we have a sister organization in the United Kingdom, which is the IEP UK. And then we have the horizontal initiatives, which is what I lead at IEP, which is basically taking the knowledge products that my research colleagues produce and making sure that they arrive in the right moment in the policy process, on the right desk, with the right people, in the right language, tailored to the audience that are reading them. So the role that we really play is that of a neutral broker. We really try to, we're not affiliated with any government, we're not directly funded by any government, we don't have any political color. We do commissioned work, and we do the work, and we deliver the work that might not necessarily be what the people that commission the work want to hear at the end of the day. But we try to really bring that unbiased information to the table. At the same time, we also try to act as that broker and convener of all these stakeholders. We like to bring together opposition and proponents of certain policies as well, to actually really try and find together that highest common denominator among stakeholders, and really trying to focus on building what makes us similar, what makes us want to move forward together, rather than focusing on what makes us different and going toe-to-toe on things that we might not be agreeing on. We do this through several networks, and I'll go a little bit more deeply into that. We do these networks actually, so we have our Think Sustainable Europe network, of which Sebastian is a member. He'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. We also have a membership network called Think 2030, which brings together private sector actors, civil society, academia, and the think tanks to really be able to promote the policy and knowledge products that we develop. So then, and one of the more interesting and specific ones that we work on is the European Sustainable Agriculture Dialogue, which is a key example, really, because it's a platform that really brings together a whole variety of actors, industry, civil society, research centers, and with the aim of which is to inform the European Union's agriculture research and innovation agenda, to actually have an impact on sustainable agriculture practices both within and outside the European Union. We really want to use this network to create and foster sustainable models and resilient food systems through open dialogues, but still operating under Chatham House rules, particularly when it pertains to industry. And of course, these are everything that is produced is backed by science-based ideas and analyses, and building from the work done during the course of the project, which started in 2019. So it really is a diverse set of organizations. And when we look at kind of how we go into Think 2030, the network is really an evidence-based and nonpartisan platform that brings together policy experts across the sectors, and twice a year we actually do a conference which under the European Union Council presidencies, where we really try to focus on the policy priorities, not only of the presidency themselves, but really trying to look forward to the future presidencies and how we can actually collaborate as a stakeholder platform. We just recently had the one with the Spanish presidency, where we also worked very, very closely with the council presidency there to actually also shape some of the council conclusions that have been promoted here under the negotiation process. And then one of our flagship publications is the European Green Deal Barometer, which is a Think 2030 co-designed product. It's an annual survey. It's an expert consultation that surveys almost 700 participants on the progress and the impression and on the resilience of the implementation of the Green Deal. So this edition, which was launched in June 2023, focused on a very first glimpse of the 2024 EU elections and the Green Deal's resilience. And until now, so the first, second, and third edition have been very much ex post. research products, but the 2024 edition, just ahead of the European election, is going to be a bit of an ex-ante survey. So really looking at the confidence of European Union experts on what might happen in the face of the European elections happening just a few months afterwards. And then we will be looking at delving a little bit more deeply into 7 national case studies on member states holding past, present, future presidencies of the Council. So we've had with France, which is very closely together with IDRI, Sweden, Spain, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Belgium, which is the country holding the next European Union presidency. And then again, looking a little bit more deeply on the impacts and influence of the European Green Deal on the third countries, not necessarily in the global south, also in the global north. So really looking at the collaborations between, for example, the free trade agreements between the EU and New Zealand, for example, the similarities and the correlation between the Inflation Reduction Act and the European Green Deal in the US. So those are kind of things that we really are also going to be delving a lot more deeply into moving forward. So all in all, I think, coming back to what we're actually here to discuss, which is also the role of science informing policy, I think it's very important that there are mechanisms within the UNFCCC process as well that focus a lot on the harder sciences, but that there is still a lot more space for kind of the policy analysis and policy science to inform, to be a part of these processes and the negotiations rather than us needing to kind of run after the fact. And that it is really our role to continue to act as independent brokers and conveners, and searching for that common ground where we really can actually turn these ideas into action and make sure that policies are backed by evidence and well informed through collaborations such as our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be part of this panel. So I think Martin presented quite well already what is the role as think tanks that we have to be both producing knowledge that would fit really relevantly into the policy process as it is, but also to be conveners to, like the ancestor the large ancestor of think tanks that is Chatham House, to be able to broker a deal between conflicting parties at the same time as, because we're environmental think tanks, being that the agreement between parties needs to be aligned with what science says on the necessity to protect the environment. I will try to, so IDRI is the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations based at Sciences Po, the political science university in Paris. I just want to say a few words about how it originated. The large research institutes in France like CNRS, the National Center for Scientific Research, or INRA on agriculture, were having the impression that they were part of a global academic community, but that they had very little capacity to actually influence the climate negotiations, because being a scientist is not the same as listening day in, day out how the politicians are negotiating and how the framing of problems is evolving in the policy sphere, quite differently from the pace of science. Not that science is slow, it's just not looking at the same object at the same time. And so you need to find something that would be fitting. And so CNRS, INRA, CIRAD, and others, with ministries and public agencies, decided to found IDRI to try and have a capacity of the French expertise to really participate to the way the negotiation on climate was framed mostly by British and American think tanks. No French bashing of the Americans. I'm sorry, really don't misunderstand me. That was not the point. One of the key elements was rather to say we need to have as much pluralism as possible in those think tanks. All are non-partisan. I believe the WRI is a non-partisan, World Resources Institute, that's what I'm talking about. They are non-partisan, we are non-partisan, IEP is non-partisan. But we have different ways to look at things. And as an example of why pluralism was necessary, there was the dominance of the policy framing about the climate negotiation after the Kyoto Protocol was very much about burden sharing, and that we needed to allocate the carbon budget between countries. If you think of political negotiability of that was really a zero-sum game negotiation that was impossible to solve. And the whole point of Laurence Tubiana, my former director, who has been the ambassador for climate for France at COP21, was to try and get from a burden sharing to a process-based bottom-up mechanism like the Paris Agreement. And that necessitated that we would have the capacity to challenge the dominant framing of the negotiation configuration that was existing in '97. So that's something that I think is quite interesting, and I must say that we are interested in the relation that we can have with science organizations that have founded us, not only to try and be the translators of what they do in research, but also out of our understanding of what are the questions in the political sphere, how to also ask new questions for research. I don't want to be too ambitious. It's not that often that we are able to ask new questions to research, but that happens sometimes. For instance, we've developed we wanted to put into the policy debate on the common agricultural policy in Europe a discussion about what if the whole of Europe was regenerative agriculture, agroecological, no pesticides. Let's look at it. Is it possible? Where are the questions, etc.? That raised very interesting questions about the demand side of things that had not been explored by the Research Institute on Agriculture and Food, which was what is the pathway of change to 2030, 2050 on the food demand side of things. And that was really our contribution to also try to contribute to the research agenda while being really spotting the political questions in the policy sphere. So that's just one thing that I think is really interesting to see how that functions. I have just a second type of point to try and also look at the variety of animals in the policy design sphere let's take the example of France. In France, we have established, the government has established just before the Yellow Vest crisis, that was quite linked to the carbon tax, a high committee on climate that is an evaluation committee officially evaluating the progress on climate policy effectiveness in France. That is scientists, 12 scientists that are in charge to evaluate each year how impactful and efficient is the climate policy of France. You have a variety of think tanks like us that try to be policy relevant and talk to government for policy design. And you have academies. I'm an associate member to the Academy of Agriculture, which is not just scientists. It's quite different from our colleague from Jordan, where you are really only scientists and actually more similar to the CNRS in France than to the Academy of Agriculture, where you have a variety of private players also being members of the Academy. And I just want to say that each of these bodies participates to try and take both an independent but also a relevant advice to policy making. As think tanks, we try to talk as often as possible to the policymakers to understand what are their needs among parliamentarians and how they are thinking of the policy making, to try and fit our research into what is actually their question from day to day. And then a lot of the discussion is to what extent if we want to be so policy relevant, how independent can we be? And that's, of course, very, very, very interesting. The High Committee on Climate is nominated by government, is supposed to be very independent, but the way that they structure also the discussion on how France is doing on climate policy is very needed, because we have a polarized policy debate in France, where some say the government does nothing, and there is no political will, and the others say the government does everything they can, and of course the reality is in between. And I just want to use that example to say, here, in this tension between independence and policy relevance, there is a very important type of interdisciplinary research that is public policy evaluation that should structure the debate. And I say interdisciplinary because it's both on climate science, it's on engineering science, it's social sciences, as you have demonstrated also on the examples on the US and the community things. So you need to have really an interdisciplinary type of research. And I was just trying to say that probably these different animals that I've just quoted from France, think tanks that are independent, so often of a private status. We are a foundation, private foundation, but reconnu d'utilité publique, which means acknowledged of public interest. So all legal status is very different. Public institutions, interface expertise institutions like the High Committee on Climate, all these different animals are very needed to have a very structured policy debate on are we doing, what is the gap to being more progress, how can we ensure that the policy making is really getting at grips with the challenges that we have. And in this context, the relation with Academy of Sciences, Academies of Technology, or the Academy of Agriculture is very important. I must say that the Academy of Agriculture, to which I participate, has been under heavy criticism for being too biased or too different. I mean, not enough peer review within it, so it's not because it's an academy that it's really functioning well. So we also, in that case, also have an issue about independence. So all these as I say, animals, because I don't know how to say better, like a taxonomy of animals, are playing in different grounds, all having to struggle between policy relevance and independence. And I think that's probably also something that is really interesting to see how in the panel there are so many different positions in this field. So thank you very much for having invited me.
Thank you to all the panelists, and I hope the audience enjoyed hearing about different entities and how they aim to provide science-based policy suggestions to different stakeholders. I want to open the floor for questions or comments. And we have a microphone somewhere that will come. Maybe as the audience is getting warmed up, I will start with a general question. Obviously, we are all here at COP28. How do you or your organizations use the opportunity and what you learn from at COP28, the people you meet, the interactions you have here with people that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise? How do you use this content to bring it back to your stakeholders, whether it's policymakers or others, on issues related to climate, to keep the discussion moving or the science advice? Anyone who wants to give it a go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be happy to start. Of course, as members of Global Young Academy, we hope to really learn from this opportunity and align our strategic planning with the relevant decisions so that we can, in the capacity of young scientists, actually facilitate the process of implementing them, while at the same time continuing to empower young scientists and enable them to really effectively contribute to the global action at many different levels, many of which might be also emerging through the discussions and exchanges here at COP, while the opportunities are also opening from some of the relevant discussions and decisions in the future. So I hope that we continue this effort, building not only connections, but also the capacities of young scientists to contribute across these levels.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess, speaking from the Colorado State University hat, I mean, bringing students to the COP is probably one of the best things, that people can't see the different perspectives of the same issue unless they experience it. And more importantly, I think for the process here is to be able to look across the table and see a peer who's from a different country, but maybe arguing about the same thing. How we think about pollinators in the United States is going to be different than how you think about pollinators in a country like here at UAE, which is incredibly dry, but has some of the oldest pollinator products in the world, and that's honey. And we think about things like honey, which are livelihood, and that connects people to a community, and think about adaptation strategies. What do we look at when we look at pollinator loss? But the honeybee is not native to the North American continent. So it's important for us to be able to look at that face to face and say, is this a sustainable solution? And is this solution adaptable for changing climate? And it may be. But now we can talk about honey, or cross-thing, and we can talk about pollinators and things with 6 legs. So that's the importance, is being able to connect communities to a process, to the science, to an outcome, to the action that you can take home and go have an extra cup of honey in your tea tomorrow and think about where it came from and why is this an adaptation strategy associated with climate change.
Thank you.
I think as we hear the ruckus outside when the doors open and close, I think that is actually that comes very nicely to the point that I want to make. I think why we're all here. I think that COP, this is one of the largest COPs ever, and it is providing. And it provides a space for activists, it provides a space for diplomats to really interact in one space and really have those conversations, those open conversations, in a space where it's all permitted and it's all allowed. And I think we can hear very loud. And I think taking that home, I think we also need, there is a need for that space for both of those things to happen. For activism to happen, for that diplomacy to happen, but it all needs to be based on scientific evidence. And that's where I think is very, very important, and that's why we're all sitting around the table here.
Thank you.
One thing that, I mean, your questions were quite a lot about what are we actually doing here and what's our practice, and to some extent, one of my main goals is I mean, one of our climate director is actually, that's something that I want to mention. Our climate director, Lola Valejo, she's been nominated as the co-chair of the mitigation work program within UNFCCC. So interestingly, the diplomats were happy to nominate a young researcher from a think tank to interact with diplomats. So I think that's an experience that we want to also learn from. The other thing that I want to say is personally, this is really an interesting place to exchange views with think tanks and research institutes from African countries and southern countries, being a European-based think tanks. There are so many misunderstandings that, I mean, as the colleague was saying about pollinators, I can say that also about the, carbon markets, about green industrialization. These are things that we need to really look at with at least an interdisciplinary lens in social sciences in Europe, but definitely when I talk to my African colleagues, for instance, Professor Okereke from Nigeria, the vision is so different. And sometimes there are things that I believe I'm doing good science, but the framing is different if I start from the point of view of a European country and from a Nigerian point of view. And it's not about relativism. It's really, really saying that the framing of the question initially needs to be really changing. And that's the types of dialogues that I'm really eager to have with scientists from Senegal, Nigeria, just to say those that I've met recently, just to exemplify.
Thank you. Let me ask if the Hussams have any comments on this, and then we will go to the question from the floor.
Which one? Me? Okay, great. So yeah, for RSS, being here this year, we brought like a quite big delegation, like up to 10 people more or less, including different more junior researchers. And some of them, it was the first time going abroad and traveling. And being here at COP and interacting with people from different parts of the world, and in particular seeing how climate change can impact countries and people very, very differently. So obviously we all read and study climate change from a scientific perspective, but like speaking with people coming from small islands, from Polynesia, for instance, we spoke a few days ago over lunch with some delegates. It was very interesting to see that they had similar challenges to Jordan. So like they also face issues of seawater intrusion into the groundwater resources and aquifers of the country. And Jordan is the third most water scarce country in the world. So obviously we have some familiarity with how to deal with groundwater resources and quality of water. And therefore it was interesting to see our researchers interacting with them and exchanging best practices on how to solve these issues. And therefore I think going back to Jordan next week, it will be interesting to see how they will then proceed and continue their work in a different way, like after having interacted and seen people from all over the world and how they're all facing climate change differently, then going back and working, it will surely have a different new motivation and passion to going forward.
Yeah, I will just echo what everybody else said. I think as somebody who, this is the second time I come to COP. I was in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. It was fun because we did a lot of snorkeling there. But I would say, coming to COP and listening to a lot of the conversation gives me the opportunity to go back and say, what is it that we need to focus on as new voices? We need to work on how can we align ourselves with some of the discussions. But I also realize that some of the discussions that take place here are brought to the table in a sort of in a loose way. There is no evidence-based science in the discussions. In fact, I went to a big meeting with high-profile people talking about natural infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And the whole discussion was centered around implementation. Now, I know, having chaired an SM workshop on nature-based solutions, that we're really far, very, very far from implementations. So how can we, as new voices, take some of the ideas that are presented here, but understand that we need to kind of mix this sort of loose qualitative thinking with evidence-based science so that we can do something that matters and can push forward with implementation, but based on some sort of science as opposed to wishful thinking, for example. So just understanding the playoffs between qualitative big picture thinking and evidence-based science and what we need to focus on, I think you cannot get that sense without being here. So I think that's one of the main benefits of being at COP here. Thanks.
Thank you. Please, and if you can start with identifying yourself. And I think we have the microphone. Okay.
As a scholar trained in the Western style of learning, that as we're looking at these multicultural issues, these various forms of knowledge that we're trying to weld and weave together, that as we think about the Western nature of academies, how do we actually change the culture there to accept these multiple sources of knowledge, especially as we work with indigenous cultures, multiple cultures? I think evidence-based or science-based and evidence-based is really important. But evidence-based knowledge can be from other fields of knowledge and experience. And I think there's a term about the financing of decolonization of finance mechanisms, of institutions. I think the academic institutions also need to think this very carefully of how do we embrace multiple cultures, multiple ways of knowing, so that we can provide a platform and encourage young leaders from broad aspects of society to really trust and learn to trust other sources of knowledge. And how do you actually, and then that's the validation of that. Because it's the evidence base is really important, but I think we need to decolonize our Western way of thinking as we look at solutions. So that's a challenge for you all.
A big one. I don't know if anyone wants to react to it. Gillian, you seem almost ready to do it.
Okay, so if I could jump in on my colleagues. I don't know how many people went to the briefing by the COP presidency this morning. But he talked about the trifecta affecting us. One is the global stocktake, the second is transparency, and the third is the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. And why that ties with Dennis's comment very well is that to move to a different place, we have to transform ourselves. And the global stocktake is just a measuring stick. And the transparency of how we got to that measuring stick is the science. But the third is the nationally determined contribution, that every country determines its own ability to get to climate neutrality, which means that you need to have the science that asks the question for that country, in the context of that country, within that country's GDP. That's what just transition is all about. And if we as scientists can't help move in that space to say how we ask just transition is based on that country, number one, not on our science. It needs to be based on that country, because the country's GDP may be based on something that changes the equation, right? Is it agricultural based? Is it fossil fuel based? Is it something else based? And then their global stocktake is going to put them in a place, and they have to measure that using tools of transparency. That's where we as scientists need to come in. And to do that, I study bees. I can talk about honey all day. I don't know anything about Kosti, right? So I need to go across the aisle, so to speak, and reach to someone who can help us answer the question of biodiversity loss writ large across all countries. So I think that's why we have to be a union and not different scientists all trying to answer our individual pet projects. We need to work together to answer this societal question.
Maybe to complement this, it's important, of course, with that notion of, in order to act globally, we also have to have a common understanding and action locally. This also applies to our scientific efforts. I think in that, to really facilitate addressing this and take into account all these variety of different perspectives, we need to nurture spaces where these interactions are possible, not only across different borders, but also disciplines scientifically. We speak about considering the indigenous knowledge, and at the same time, we speak about understanding different perspectives from other disciplines in science, including natural sciences and social sciences. I think this is where platforms, such as a variety of different academies that bring these members and academics from different disciplines together in order to creating spaces to interact. We can, of course, use these spaces to learn from each other, and then from the same perspective of acting globally, but also locally, bring this knowledge and integrate this into our local spaces in order to foster these interactions, to take all the tools that are available to really address the pressing challenges by taking all these perspectives into consideration.
I'll just follow up really quickly. One thing I completely agree, and I will definitely give tons of credit to NASEM, because when they established the New Voices program, the whole idea was to bring these people from different areas and different disciplines together and let them do whatever the heck they want. And that sense of freedom, we can ask questions that has not been asked before. We could actually ask questions that might be a little bit, making somebody uncomfortable. They are completely fine with that. We work on whatever we want. We're freeing our minds to look outside of NASEM and outside of the US and what's going on. We are looking at, for example, displaced scientists because of climate change and because of conflicts. We're looking at many other things that we're not told what to look into. And to Giovanna's point, of course, I will just, for those who don't know, we are hosting, by we I mean the New Voices at NASEM, the Global Young Academy General Meeting in Washington, D.C. In May 2024. We're bringing everybody, all young academies from around the world, and that's a wonderful platform for figuring out what's working in your academy, what are you working on, how can we collaborate, how can we do things together. We're not exactly there where Dennis was saying, but I think we're heading in the right direction. Hopefully we'll continue in that direction, yeah.
Hussam?
If I may, I really like your question. Thank you very much for raising this point. And I completely agree with you on the need of understanding what is knowledge and how to capture all the knowledge of local communities, and so on and so forth, which is often overlooked. This is something that we've been discussing very much, and that's my third hat as Arab Council for Social Sciences. With the Arab Council for Social Sciences, we're trying to decolonize knowledge in this region, because often research, especially on political science, social sciences on the Middle East, is done using concepts, frameworks, and methods from Europe and from the US, from the global north. Instead, we believe that we should rethink the methods and concepts and frameworks that we're using to better understand what's going on in the Middle East when it comes to conflicts, wars, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the concepts that we're using, we believe, are not the best or the appropriate ones. Instead, we are trying to have local concepts and local and different methods, more appropriate methods to better understand and study this region. In addition, as RSS, and that's my other hat, we are trying to we are studying climate science and the impacts of climate change on the most marginalized groups in Jordan. And to do so, we are both using climate science, and therefore we have our scientists in RSS, but also we are going to interact with the local communities, doing more ethnographic and anthropological kind of research, but also trying to have the experiences of the local community, especially in the Azraq region in the north east of the country, to speak to our research. And therefore, we are using methods such as open street mapping to have the local communities designing and telling us what's important in their community and why it's important and so on and so forth. And that's for us as important as the research that is being done by our scientists. Just because like, they're just capturing different dimensions of the problem, and then we will bring them together and trying to better understand the complex issue of climate change.
Thank you. Maybe I can add from the perspective
Rania.
of the US.
Sorry, could I just say one thing else?
Sure, sure.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I think looking at it from a European perspective, I think, well, a lot of people might think that the EU is a very homogenous kind of region. It actually is not, and I would actually encourage everybody. Every year we publish the European Green Deal Barometer, and even the results there see quite big disparities in what people think is important if you look at Northern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. So even in a region where things are might seem quite homogeneous, the priorities for all of us are very, very different. Whereas in Western Europe, which very recently looked at had the energy crisis, that's much more important. Whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, the focus is much more on the efficiency of governments and their ability to implement policies in a transparent way. So there is also that big difference there. So I think we always need to try and approach these things with that optic that not all solutions are one-size-fits-all solutions, and that everything does need a very tailored approach, and you can only achieve that through effective consultations with your stakeholders and real kind of and real grassroots level engagement.
Thank you. Let's move on. A question from the audience. We went back. Yeah.
Matthias Huber from Ecological Institute. Super grateful for you organizing this event, for full transparency. We as an institute, we're members of Think 2030 and are collaborating often and well with both IEP and IDRI. Good to see you both. And I want to come back to sort of this wording from the title of your event, which is on policy, on advice from science to policy, in this tension that Sébastien picked up on between independence, where as independent places for research, you know, where you can create these spaces, have this freedom to explore that you were describing, but at the same time having to basically, you know, also get your hands dirty, if you will, on here at the COP, it's the negotiation text, but back home it's advice to policymakers on how to design instruments. And one of the things that we've been looking at is indeed the emergence of these kind of more formalized bodies for providing scientific advice to governments as one means of trying to get closer, become more policy relevant. But indeed, then there's the question of, you know, to what extent are you losing your independence? Are you losing that freedom to explore? And so I would be very much interested in your reflections on, you know, this tension, moving the closer you move to policy, you know, sort of where that starts getting you into trouble. Thank you.
Another challenging question. Who would like to give it a go? Sebastian.
I just start quite quickly. I mean, we work quite a lot with Ecologic on trying to advise our own governments, and then it becomes tricky when we try to have Germany and France agreeing on anything, particularly currently, and that's really a pity. I'm half German, half French, and I'm so angry at that situation, but that's another point. No, I think one of the key elements is, of course, that from the think tank's perspective, you need to build a kind of a confidence, trustful relation with the policymakers so that they really valorize what you say and use the critical standpoint where you show that you are not agreeing with the policy on some specific stances very exceptionally to really show where you think that this is wrong, and that's a kind of a nuclear weapon for thanks to their relation with the policymaker. I might be caricaturing. There are very often in France where IDRI is publishing papers saying that the government is not on the right track to this and that, or that they should, for instance, on food policy, that they don't regulate enough the food retailers, etc. So trying to set new issues on the agenda. But basically, I think on the continuum between independence and policy relevance, I feel very much that we need to be close and build this confidence relationship, and that prevents us a little bit from being too critical, but then gives us a lot of power when we criticize government and say this policy is not aligned with what you see on science, etc. So this is just to say, I'm not trying again to say that there is a relativity of science behind what we are saying. If you're a very independent science body or a think tank, we all use all the same methodologies that are making what we say sound and rigorous. But the way you frame it in terms of impacting the policy debate might be very different, and that's probably something where I think it's very, very useful to have that in mind. And as Martin was saying, there are misunderstandings between the French and the German governments. I was just saying to Andreas Jung, some of the member of the Franco-German Parliamentary Assembly, talking to him, he was saying, what is it that does not function between France and Germany on the energy strategy? And I try to say that some of it is also the way that the French engineers believe only a centralized solution functions, while the Germans understand very well that federalism and decentralized functions without being inefficient. And that's just it's cultural background, as you were saying. You don't need to go to, I mean, of course your question is much more challenging, but already between those two types of engineering culture, there is a gap that we need to solve, and both are really rigorous in science. Mm-hmm. And I'm very sorry, I need to leave at 15:15, and so I'm very sorry to be the bad guy who will leave a panel at some point. Sorry for that.
No problem, thank you. You had given us a heads up about that. Gillian.
I was just going to say quickly, I think one of the issues that we run into, having served on the U.S. National Climate Assessment very recently, which just published, and they did a really nice job on it, I think, is it between being policy relevant and policy prescriptive. And the IPCC divides this line all the time. How do you become policy relevant, policy prescriptive? And I would argue what we've forgotten to do as scientists is simply tell a story. And tell a story that society can get and policymakers can get. If we get our science too far ahead, we become policy prescriptive. But if we get our science too far behind, then we're no longer relevant. So being able to tell that story, I think, is really important. And I think for the young scientists coming up, who I think many of them fear policy, or they don't want to be a scientist who's, get beat up by the policy makers, that dance is hard for them to pick up. How do you become policy relevant versus policy prescriptive? And I think I see the lights right in my eyes, but one of our lead authors from the U.S. National Climate Assessment is here, is Pam from Rutgers University. And that was a constant struggle, is we want the report to be used by communities. We don't want it to be shoved into one political arena versus another. And that's really our job as scientists, to make the data that solid that we are policy relevant.
Thank you. Giovanna?
I wanted to add to that, actually, about the question of course, informing and being policy relevant, but also in the context of building trust. I think this is the key, and I tried to emphasize this during this intervention, is that the importance here is really to establish these connections over a period of time, or to have bodies that can facilitate establishing these connections so that the trust can be built in order to enable this exchange and have transparency in the level of the independence and the contributions to the policy making. I think we are discussing this a lot at the Global Young Academy in the context of the Science Advice Working Group, where we try to really train young scientists to engage in these spaces. So just for context, the Global Young Academy does not directly advise any governmental bodies, but we really try to enable and build the capacity of young scientists to engage in these spaces, either with their national governments or through a number of different associations or programs from the International Science Council through reporting for the IPCC and many others, where in that effort, we also believe that it is important, this engagement at the early career level is then also important for building this trust throughout the longer period of time, and not only trust, but also the experience and the relationship through that time. I also want to emphasize, apart from then building these programs to build the capacity and relationships, we're also asking a lot this question of compromising now the integrity when it comes to independence, And I don't have the definite answer, but I'm very interested in having this discussion also beyond this panel. The question of, during these dynamic times in which we operate with all the global challenges, what are really the boundaries between the honest broker and the issue advocate? And whether really bridging these boundaries is perhaps even called for and necessary today to accelerate some of these actions. So do we need to maybe all question, how do we redefine these boundaries between the honest brokery and the issue advocacy? And do we really need to exclude the involvement in these two branches in order to effectively make change happen, from the policy implementation to the general level? So maybe a question to everyone I'll be hoping to discuss as well. So thank you for bringing this up, that stimulated it.
Sorry to take the floor and then leave, but I think, no, this is really important because I talked to the team at my think tank, trying to tell them where we stand between honest broker and how do you say, issue advocate. I believe that there is no such a thing as a complete neutral honest broker, and that it's better to acknowledge what is your normative standpoint, so that people understand what issue you're advocating for. Not an interest, but an issue advocate, as you said. That would be my stance, saying we are never completely free of a normative standpoint on how we frame the questions, and it's better to make it transparent rather than say you are a completely objective, neutral broker. At least when you're a think tank, as I am on sustainability, we say we start from IPCC and IPBS, and for some, this is already being degrowth oriented in the French debate when you draw all the consequences. So this is good to say, where are you starting from? I'm starting from what IPBS and IPCC are saying.
Thank you. So a lot about this session is networking, connecting different entities with interest in science policy. I want to give an opportunity to any one of you who wants to introduce your own entity to do so. I think all of us here welcome interacting with entities we haven't in the past, and actually COP28 was an opportunity for us to meet the IEP. It was kind of a forced marriage that worked extremely well in terms of this session. So if anyone wants to do that, and I saw that you had a question as well, maybe we can do that after.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm Kim Fulis. I'm actually wrapping up my PhD at CSU on YouTube, but I'm a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research at the same time. So yeah, I wanted to put a plug in for INCAR. It's NSF funded under the umbrella of UCAR for a couple of reasons. One, because we have a convergent science program that I think is amazing. And two, we have a Rising Voices program that is also really wonderful. And I just wanted to share, Rising Voices is our attempt, or the attempt within INCAR, to incorporate non-Western ways of knowing alongside Western science. And I just wanted to share that one of their big learning opportunities in that program was realizing the pace difference in incorporating that knowledge. You know, Western science happens at a certain pace and with a certain kind of understanding about relationships, and in working with their indigenous partners, that pace and that relationship building and that trust building was very different, and that was a really wonderful learning opportunity for Western scientists. I actually work more at the water-climate interface, and I'm going to kind of flip this around and ask another question, which is related partially to my frustration in getting a PhD in a traditional academic setting, and then kind of the freedom that I've now found at INCAR, which is, you know, how do you feel about, you know, I have this funny quote I read somewhere, like, the real world has problems and academia has departments. And that's what I was running into in some of my grad work, was that I really, you know, at my core wanted to span boundaries across water and climate, and even in bridge over into social sciences from engineering, which was my home department. And it's hard. And I kind of expand that to thinking about, you know, how process and institutional structure plays a role even in how we're all over here in side events and the negotiators are over there. And so at what point are we interacting and influencing? And so just if there's, you know, I know we're kind of pivoting to sharing about our own organizations, but if at any point you have a moment to offer any thoughts on how you think about institutional structure or changes in that that enables better science policy integration, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get a couple of responses, and I definitely want to come to your question as well.
So I'll just, you know, having been in academia for a while now, and since you're kind of walking kind of that route of getting a PhD and doing research, I would tell you my personal experience. By training, I'm a structural engineer. Works on, my PhD was on seismic behavior of steel buildings. The first paper I wrote after my PhD was looking at cervix-uterus interaction for premature birth. It had nothing to do with my PhD. My advisor thought I was crazy. And I just wanted to offer the advice. And of course, when I went to CSU, naturally what I would work on is structural engineering. But my brain started to think outside of that. We have a wonderful sort of admin system at Colorado State. Nobody tells you what to do. I started to work on many different topics, including climate-related. We developed a model for COVID-19 transmission. I did it with my PhD student. And I mean, my advice is do not look at this time now as this is it, right? I'm getting a PhD. I feel confined and constrained and I can't go anywhere. I wanted to look outside and this is not fun. Once it's done, you know, assuming you have the liberty to do that, in my opinion, do whatever you want. It's because you have to enjoy the process. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. So I'm providing myself as an example of, you know, yeah, there are boundaries within systems, within departments, within universities, but it's, in my personal opinion, with my personal experience, it's very, very easy to cross it without anybody even, you know, telling you anything negative. Matter of fact, they actually encourage it. Where I come from at Colorado State. So that's just my own experience.
Giovanna?
It might be worth complementing this with the information that there are these types of experiences within the Global Young Academy to perhaps encourage you to think about this beyond. But I want to also follow up on the point that you were making here in terms of the boundary spanning. The effective science for policy, it really indeed seems to require this spanning of boundaries between also science, policy, and society. And so far, there are not many effective programs that are offered to scientists to enable this. There are science for policy programs that are also focused more nationally. But when you think about these global perspectives, I'm mentioning this in the context that there are a number of emerging initiatives through the Global Young Academy, through a number of different international institutions, with the aim to develop these curricula that offer perspectives for science for policy more internationally, or more importantly, looking also into the role of science diplomacy in this context. So I'm following up on something that you have already mentioned in the context of the RSS. The science diplomacy perspectives are here very relevant in terms of using the science as a basis and a common language to enable science for policy internationally and as a tool for peace and general development. Interestingly enough, there is no such career path today as a science diplomat. We have scientists and we have diplomats, but I hope that this perspective is emerging. So this is really a dynamic time where many of the institutions across the globe are attempting to develop these programs. One of them is recently announced also in Switzerland, now speaking with my hat as a Swiss Young Academy member. It's the GESDA, the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator Initiative, that is now developing a global curriculum for science diplomacy in collaboration with a number of different institutions, which is something that might be worth looking into in terms of these global efforts and collaborations to establish some of these missing links and platforms for future boundary spanners as well.
Thank you. Maybe a quick comment, Gillian, before we move on.
It can be a quick comment, just a call out on a couple of big programs. Number one is that the Fulbright program has been around for many decades, and it brings U.S. scientists and others to other countries as an exchange. Number two is that if you go to the U.S. Center here, most of them are PhD scientists and negotiators, and they come through the AAAS program, American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Diplomacy, track. And if you look at most of our advisors from USAID, they come through that program. So those programs are there. They are for PhD students. They've been around for a long time. This is the 65th class for AAAS. And it's, I don't know what it is for Fulbright now. Fulbright is way up there. So it's important to look around, and I think the issue is the visibility of those programs is changing now with climate science coming up and the importance of, but they exist. And as an emerging PhD, I would urge you to take out the AAAS fellowship.
Let's go back to the question or comment that you have.
My name is Hyun Park. I am a postdoctoral researcher from the Wagner University in the Netherlands, but I hold my PhD at the Colorado State University of Political Science, so I'm also one of the kids of CSU. So it's really nice to see you all from Colorado, but also it was really nice to kind of hear from your successful stories, how to collaborate, build a partnership. But based on my experience as well, also originally from South Korea, not every countries, not every communities are, they have such a culture of collaboration, easily crossing boundaries between policy academia, but also cross-disciplinaries. So for instance, in South Korea, we have lots of debates about whether nuclear energy is a clean energy or not. And depends on your discipline, everyone speaks differently. So it's really hard to make one voice, even within a scientific community, and then advocate towards a policymaker. So I just want to hear your experience of what was the challenges talking and building the coalition within the academia for going towards the policymakers and how you overcome it.
And don't get us wrong, I don't think there is a single voice in any of these entities, which is the beauty of it. Scientists like to use their arguments.
I would just say that quickly. In academia, you have the liberty to work with your student and you're minding your own business for the most part. Let's say maybe 85% of your work. You collaborate with whoever you want to collaborate with. But I will mention with the new voices, we were brought together. I did not select who's going to work with me and vice versa. We did actually, it was really a fascinating experience because we worked together for 2 years. And there was a lot of tension at the very beginning. And somebody would say something and I'm thinking, he's completely off. And he's thinking, I'm completely off. But actually, after working together for a while, we kind of converged on sort of, a way forward. We had better understanding of each other. And sometimes I would reflect on some of the comments that were said in the meeting, and I'm thinking, you know what, he had a point. And so it takes getting used to. And I think if we do a lot of it, then we become more accustomed to accepting other thoughts and other ideas. Now, how to take that to policymakers, that's a different story. But I tell you, my experience working, we were 22 people, the climate group, 12 people, meeting online to talk about different things, coming from many, many different angles. So it was a fun experience, but it was tiring at the beginning. Yeah.
Anyone else? I know okay, all right. Last word from you.
Just a remark in that regard. I think I agree with you that these programs are not universal and the possibilities are very different nationally and working internationally. And I want to just emphasize that sometimes taking these first steps in the engagement really opens the path for the others. There are many examples for this within the European Union, for example. I have worked on one of the many hats, we are all wearing many hats, is the one with the European Young Chemist Network, for example, that they have not had the platform for interacting with policymakers, but we have contributed to establishing one. And now, for example, young chemists are one of the stakeholders in the European Green Deal's efforts with the sustainability by design and many others. So in general, I think these efforts are very important because they really open the way to all of us moving away from this perspective of young scientists or young professionals as leaders of tomorrow and really help us establishing this notion of them being recognized as leaders of today, but opening the path to really empowering them to lead this way for transformative changes in the future.
Thank you. With that, I think it's time to close the session. I can see the next session presenters are waiting to get in. Thank you very much to the panelists for great presentations and comments. And thank you to the audience. I really appreciate your participation. Thank you.